wondering. So I was saying how I was still at that quote about at this page, and so I was talking about this helmsman. Who could this helmsman be? And I was saying that on the one hand, it could be a sailor on a ship, or a figure that was evoked by the previous meeting with the old man. And in this case, it could be Charon, right? The ferryman of dead souls. And I was commenting that the space of the boat, like the bedroom in Moskvina's poem, represents death and the cradle, because the boat, even the mortuary one, participates in its essence in the greater theme of the maternal lullaby, as the anthropologist Duran wrote. So this funerary quality permeates all elements of the poem, including the setting in the Nivaz embankment where the woman is walking. And so the cool air of the evening winds also possessive a destructive quality. Вздуйте синие бугры, зиб на зибе налегаях, захлестни отважный челн, хляб разверзись, поглоти. And so here the disconnect between reality and imagination, as well as the imagery sequake that takes place while все тихо, все спокойно, foreshadows this unhappy ending for the eye, who bitterly recognizes the unavoidability of death that will come after enduring grief. And so a distinguishing feature of selfhood, torn by a painful, incurable illness and facing her own demise, is her desire for death to quickly put an end to her sorrow and suffering, as we see here, где эти смерть, изнемогаю. Despite lacking concrete details and biographical information, the eye's assertive tone makes her seemingly abstract argumentation more heartfelt and personal. She praises and provides a positive characterization of death because she says death is not so terrible. It can bring lasting peace. It can erase life's challenges. And since Yankelevich maintains the last words, or ultima verba, uttered by a person on the threshold of not being, bear a completely different sonority from worded discourses. Her urgency to communicate, prompted by her growing awareness there is little time to live, reveal a personal lyric voice. As with Moskvina's, also the voice in Bunina's lyric emerges from a concrete situation and possesses a physicality that is strengthened by her illness and suffering. So here death appears not only as fear of this unavoidable unknown, but also as the torment of present suffering inscribed in the body and mind. So fighting against illness triggers a new type of heroism that the eye develops in her everyday life. Lamentation before death leaves room for the fervor of protest, which nourishes greater detachment from traditional spirituality. So if Bunina, as Roslin has noticed, does not espouse the romantic idea that disease ennobles the sufferer, she nevertheless shapes a lyric persona who is not rebellious but combative, a believer who still questions her deepest creed. So Bunina's voice, like Moskvina's, is lofty and develops an intimate lyric that is monumental as a triumphal ode, we may say, employing mythologies, figure of speech, symbolism, hybridizing them also with the narrative writing style of a diary entry. And so as Kuchelbecker commented in his review, Mrs. Bunina shaped her own path and formed her talent without using the creations of other talents. In Walk by Bunina, lines are at times gloomy, at times frightful, at times moving, picturesque, and pensive. And so by composing a thematically and stylistically variegated lyric, Bunina bravely chooses to share this suffering with the readers. A specific illness in this case, in which she names her bodily symptoms and pain and entering thoughts. The resulting personal eye is both a victim but also the poem's undisputed hero. And so to conclude, these lyrics by Moskvina and Bunina contradict the idea that the suffering of women, as Melissa Tiger wrote, the suffering of women is doomed to remain speechless, incoherent, or excessive. Or as Hadisevich wrote, as a human document, female poetry is more meaningful and valuable as actual poetry. So the poems by Moskvina and Bunina cast the individual's everyday life as solemn, demonstrating that selfhood is heroic, even when dealing with human circumstances that are traditionally considered less noble, so to say. Further, they introduce new traits to the lyric persona, like corporeality and physical sensibility. They express a feeling that is universal, insofar as it is shared by the entire humankind, but also underscore the uniqueness of personal experience through gender identity and individuality. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you for this very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical cock-up. I hope that we can glue together the two bits, but one of our colleagues is very gifted with technical, with IT related things, so I'm pretty sure that she will come up with a solution. Thanks again. That was very interesting, and I'm sure that we all have lots of questions, so fire away. Do we have any questions or comments? Please, dear colleagues, dear students, the floor is yours. I do have a few questions, but I will leave them for later. Yes, Laetitia, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Erika. It was deeply enlightening. I wanted to ask you a question on my behalf and also on the behalf of the colleague of whom Rodolphe has just talked about, because she's working on the poets' tombs, you know, monuments in poetry. And so I was thinking, because you mentioned and you showed us the picture of Peter the Great on his deathbed, and you talked briefly about the connection between these kind of paintings and the poems you were about to study. So could you tell us more about it? Is it a trend? Is it something that appears in the first half of the century, or?
Are you referring to this trend of depicting death, or?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, celebrities on their deathbed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, yes. Well, on the one hand, I would say there are other works by, for instance, of Dvovin, right, who showed how in painting at the turn of the 18th century, individuality was emerging, right? And so he does show by showing this turn from icons to persona to portrait. And he also shows how this phenomenon is, so to say, encouraged by certain features or motifs. So for sure there is the motif of portraiture, but also other motifs like certain spaces, like again the night time, so as a space that kind of like invites more of a more introspection or individuality. And so I was drawing in painting because it seems to me interesting that something similar seems to be going on both in poetry and in painting, and maybe other art forms as well. So this seems to be, you know, for sure, you know, a trend in poetry and in painting, but also a broader cultural shift that is happening, right? So that's why I was drawing comparison with other art forms. And when it comes to poetry, the theme of death and really show how even in studies they show how death was one of the main topics in poetry at the turn of the century, right? So it is in part due to this to the Baroque movement and the shift from Baroque to early Enlightenment, and it seems to be a topic that really well fits also the cultural climate. Speaking of, I don't know, for instance, orthodoxy, and so yes. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up question and comment. The entire period is obsessed with death, as you just said, and sentimentalism is in large proportions, about that. And I mean, not so much maybe about death as about the pleasures of mourning, about mourning and the pleasures of mourning, which is kind of a higher form to express sympathy and communicate with others. And as I was listening to your talk and reading the verses on the screen, what struck me is that there might be a connection there with yet another form of art, which was very popular at the time, which is, and actually it is connected with what Laetitia just said, which is funeral sculpture. And because the way she I mean they, right, and that will be my next question, because I'm not quite sure that I understood the whole situation with the Moskvina sisters, and I would love to hear your what you have to say about that. But it struck me as, demonstrating a certain pleasure about writing a text which will verbally be the equivalent of a funeral monument. And we have all seen so many. I mean, if you go to a cemetery, especially to a cemetery in St. Petersburg, where there are so many tombs from that period, and I mean, it's literally crammed with monuments showing mourning figures. So I was wondering about, this attempt to come up with a verbal equivalent of that. That's one thing. And the other thing is that is there a kind of pleasure about, anticipating through your own verse, the pleasure that you will unfortunately miss because you'll be dead when people will be gathering around you and mourn you. So that's my first question. Thank you. And comment. And Amanda has something to say about that. I saw that in the chat section.
I just put in the chat that I was having a similar thought and wondering about whether these were almost self-elegies in a way.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So yes, I think there are several trends that are, yes, in my answer I focus mostly on the first half of the century, but there are several trends like sentimental literature, but also this is the time when much Gothic and graveyard poetry is being both translated and written. So there seems to be really like a very strong, they seem to be working very much within this trend. At the same time, what it seems also interesting is that, for instance, when we read sentimental Gothic graveyard poetry, written by other Russian authors at the time, there is still this element, or at least I can perceive, let me know what you think, this element of idealization is still somewhat idealized or polished at times, it seems to me. What I found interesting about especially Bunina's poem is that she seems to try to move beyond that and even focus on both unspoken and unpleasant aspects of the experience of illness, and that awareness that, probably will lead her to dying. And so that's what I found innovative within this bigger trend that she's working in. And then, yes, actually connection with funeral culture and are actually a lot. And the more I read about it, the more it becomes actually striking. And it seems to be this one seems also to be a broader trend, right? Because there are also other poems like well, I was thinking about the famous elegy by Trediakowski, which is almost on the death of Peter I, right? Which is almost like walking us through the actual building and statues that were at the funeral of Peter I, right? So when we have all the gods and goddesses talking, then if we look at the documents that kind of show how the funeral was organized, we kind of find out that basically these were the sculptures that were there. And similar, there is this other poem by Piotr Buslaev, which is called Umozritelstwo duszewne, which is about the death of Maria Streganova. It's dated, if I'm not mistaken, 1735. And there too, he is basically representing in this poem almost the icon of the ascension to heavens. And so there too, you can see there is this bigger trend of this very strong fascination with death practices, broadly conceived, funerals, celebrations, going to the cemetery. So that seems to be there too. And about the Moskvina sisters, what was exactly your question?
Well, the question is that I couldn't help but notice, but maybe I'm wrong about that as you were, delivering your paper, you tended to say like Moskvina sisters, then she wrote that or she said that. And it's interesting to see how, I mean, as I understand it, there were two sisters, right? And I was wondering about any information that you could have about who was writing what, how did they write together? Because there are actually people working on that. I think that our colleague from St. Andrews, Margarita Weisman, works on that right now about people working together as couples, as writing couples, and trying to find out. I mean, she has a gender approach, of course, because most quite frequently men would be signing the books, and in fact they would be helped by a woman standing or sitting next by. But I was wondering whether you had any information about how they work together.
So I can share what I know, but then I know there is something in the room who might know something too, in the sense that what I have read so far, at least, is that the poem is included in this collection of poems titled Aonia, which was published in 1802 and was signed by this two sisters. The two sisters are Maria and Yekaterina, if I'm not mistaken. And it seems that they authored the collection together. However, within the collection, it is not clear, so to say, who composed what, or as you propose, if they worked on poems together. So the authorial relationship, or yes, is not very clear. So as far as I know, there have been a few theories, one of which is that the actual author would be Maria, because we know that Yekaterina seems to have been very busy with familial life. But I think, there could be something more to discover about this. Their life is actually a bit like, we know some things, but we don't know also many things, such as we know that they were very well educated, but we don't know exactly what they read, what they had access to, what they knew. So I think there could be like space to discover more here. But I don't know if Amanda has some other observations.
I was just looking at what I said in my own book, and it was really coming from the biographický slovar, like pisatели, and basically exactly just what you said, that it seems like maybe Elizaveta was the other sister, maybe had nothing to do with it. But then I think that raises an interesting question of why the fiction, why have the fiction of it being the sisters? What was that kind of doing? What was that achieving?
Maybe that was some kind of trend. I suppose that if you explore British or French poetry at the time, then there might be some other sisters there. The text being a sort of how do you say that? Celebration of family ties and of family friendship, even if there's only one person writing there. Oops.
Female writers.
Hello, sorry, we missed that.
Oh yeah, no, I was saying that's actually a good idea because throughout the 18th century, the female authors were drawing parallelisms with French female writers like Russophone or Carrasco were compared with de la Suze and so on. So that could be actually something.
And I mean, sisters seem to be heroic figures in fiction in the early 19th century. I mean, if you think about, the fictions of Jane Austen, for instance, I mean, they really staged that sisterly relationship. And yeah, I would love to hear questions from the audience. What, sorry? Yes, of course. We have a question there. Sorry. So, yeah, вы можете включить звук сами? Ну, давайте. Сами.
Sorry. So my question was about your analysis. Yeah, sorry. Okay, we're good. My question was about your analysis of Bunina. You mentioned that she was having some sort of doubts about God and his universally good side. But do you know, for instance, if there were some poems at the time which could have embraced maybe suicide in case of this eternal suffering and illness that was tormenting and torturing the persona? I mean, if they had questions about the existence of God, why maybe there was something new about the approach of life as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Actually, this aspect of her faith is something I've been deeply thinking about because I started by thinking that she was fully questioned, like as I started analyzing the poem, I first thought she was fully questioning the existence of God and basically kind of like negating it, because she's not just addressing God, right? She's not just asking questions to God. She's really questioning, how can this type of God exist? If God exists, how can these other experiences exist? Right? How can God allow for this type of suffering, for this type of pain? So it's a deeper type of questioning that, as I said, it borders with a metaphysical questioning. So really questioning her system of values. Then I was reading another book by Wendy Roslin, and she actually thinks that she is questioning God, but she's not questioning on the verge of, being atheist or denying the existence of God. And so I thought that maybe I was pushing a bit too much on that side. And maybe since she's invoking God, this could be still a trace that she's not fully negating the existence of God, right? She still sees God as an interlocutor in her conversation. So in this sense, it could be that she didn't go, so to say, so in depth in her questioning, in her doubting. And I didn't find traces in other poems of hers. That's the other thing I wanted to do, like find traces of, you know, this deep questioning that would border with like basically denying the idea of God. So that's why I didn't go so in depth with that part of the analysis, but it's something I'm kind of like thinking about. Thinking about suicide. Well, there are certain thinkers, right, that are becoming more and more popular at the time, coming from France, that, you know, challenge belief in God more strongly, and they have been popular, for instance, in these circles. But also right now I'm trying to think about suicide in a poem, and in this moment I can't think of one. So I will think about this more deeply. So thank you.
Suicide is an obsession with both Karamzin and Radishev, of course. I mean, they discuss it all the time.
Yes, but I was thinking poet.
Central, I know, but I mean, it's really central in sentimentalism in general.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a few words about the audience of these poems and the staged audience? Because in the first poem, I assume, I mean, I was interested to see that the poems you picked, they describe antithetical situations, in the sense that the lyrical hero in the first one is you know, surrounded by loving, caring people, whereas the lyrical hero in the second poem is absolutely alone, right? It's totally alone. And I was wondering about the gender of the people surrounding this, you know, suffering, dying woman in the first poem, considering that you said a lot about the bedroom as a new kind of space. I was wondering about the people who would, you know, sit next to a dying woman. I assume, but I could be wrong, that she would have been, you know, surrounded mostly by women. And so due to mourning or people sitting next to her bed of suffering, sort of embody the audience that she's addressing in her poem, and what does it say about you know, the public for of these poems in general. And I think that it can probably be connected with a larger question. You said that, you know, this poetry helped redefining poetry and had a huge influence on the formation of lyrical poetry in the 19th century. And I'm pretty sure that's right. But how do we know? And I mean, it's a good thing that you quoted Kuchelbecker at the end. How do we know? What do we know exactly about how men received that kind of poetry?
Yes. So trying to answer in order. So about the people who are present in the poem. So the poem by Moskvina addresses любезные друзья, right? And so and she repeatedly, like in various sections of the poem, she mentions the people who were around her. So in a way, we know that during her illness, she was surrounded by people. She most, as far as I remember right now, she uses the plural. I don't recall her mentioning like a specific gender throughout the poem, like, oh, I'm surrounded by this group of people. But the fact that she keeps mentioning these friends, it seems to me, again, oh, sorry, did I interrupt something?
No, go ahead.
It seems to me that it poses her still in this cult of friendship that was very much typical of sentimentalism, seems to me. And it seems to me that the people she's referring to are both her dear ones, so a circle of friends, family, but also the people who were attending to her, so who were taking care of her in the house as she was sick.
And
so this, yes,
who probably were women.
Yes, and so they probably were women. Yes, absolutely. So in her poem, I would say I would identify these two major like presences and coming to like human presences. Whereas in Bunina's poem, she is mostly alone. And then there is this meeting with this person, this old man. So in this sense, it is in a way still a solitary encounter, right? Because it's just a person meeting another person. It's not like Moskvina, who is surrounded by this group of possibly women. But and what is interesting here is that there is this almost play with mirroring and reacting, right? Because this old man seems to be also sick and ill as she is, but also invites her to react. She first reacts like rejecting him, but then asking him for help. And then this old man seems, I don't know, to almost change his appearance and becoming this helmsman. So I think what is also interesting in this poem is both her loneliness, but also this relationship between reality and imagination, right? Because then she also has this other, we could say, encounter with God, this dialogue with God. And so there is this, I would say, I don't know, we could say kind of fluid boundary between the internal and the external. And so in this sense also, I was meaning that she has this opposition between herself, and that's also why she's lonely, right? Between herself and society. But also, she also still has this communication with the outside, even if maybe it's filtered by her imagination, her inner thoughts. But I don't see her as fully opposed, so to say, to society. And so this would be coming to like the human presences in the poem. When we're talking about reception, who was extremely, he praised her very explicitly in his review. But then we have other critics at the time, like Vissarion Belinsky, who said that basically the only role of Bunina, like he very strongly criticized her. He said something like the only role that Bunina had was to kind of open up, I don't know, spaces for other women to write, but she was really not like, you know, so to say, a good poet, as he was saying in his review. And so his most famous critique of Bunina is in this article, Russian Literature in the year 1841, if I'm not mistaken. And so, so even if we can go from, you know, two very strong extremes here, so strong critique and strong praise, still it seems that this poem was being read and actually did affect the imagination of readers, male and female alike. And so it must have, so to say, done something in the cultural space of the time. When it comes to the Moskvina sisters, at least so far I found less evidence, but it seems that the collection was well received read, because it was also supported by these two authors, editors, if I find their names, Blank and Podshivalov, who were in the Karamzin circle, and also supported other female authors like Bunina, Svinina. And so they had an audience that I would say was going well beyond the familiar or friendly circle, but was very well affirmed in the literary sphere of the time.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Françoise Defarge.
Oui, bonjour, hello, and thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I've got a very simple question. This new space in Russophone lyrics you are talking about, do you think women, as you showed, were contributors, or were they major contributors and participated in opening new spaces and doors?
It seems to me that when it comes to the elements I focused on, which are introspection and physicality and talking about everyday life in a way that is not, or at least less idealized, they are actually major contributors. Because even if I think about authors like Državin, right? There are several articles and books written about how Državin really introduced this biographic eye into Russian poetry. Yes, of course, but at the same time, almost I think any poem, you can still perceive a degree of some sort of like idealization, because he still shapes an eye that is bearer of certain ethical, metaphysical, ontological values. And in order for him to do so, to shape this type of eye, he of course mentions elements from his biography and from his everyday life, but they do bear a certain amount or level of idealization. And the same goes if I think about other authors at the time, poems I'm talking about, right? Karamzin and Radishev, there is still this element, you can still perceive this element of the idealization. And this is confirmed also by other studies, right? I mentioned in that as I was presenting Andreas Schönle, right? That's one of the big points he makes about sentimental culture, right? So it seems to me that this is the innovation, the main innovation, and in which they are major contributors, I would say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat section from one of our students. Can you see it?
Yes, this is a good question. I have sorry, I'm thinking.
Take your time. The question is about gender differences in representation of death in Russian poetry at the time.
Yeah, I'm thinking because I would not like to end up in a way gendering too much, so to say, because in the end I would say death is like probably to say, and end up like gendering too much. But something that is coming to my mind now as I'm thinking about male and female poems about death. For instance, there is this poem that Radishev wrote about the death of his first wife. And what I found interesting about that poem is that it is very philosophical. It is very heartfelt, of course, sentimental, we may say, but it is also very philosophical. So he is kind of like almost like going through this process of mourning the death of his first wife as he writes the poem, but he's also turning this personal mourning into a chance to really question the existence of God, a system of values, ontology, like who are we? And this is not that we don't have this here, right? Because again, Bunina very strongly and explicitly reflects on this as well. But whereas Bunina reflects with this by really merging the biographical and everyday physical, this physical pain and experience she's going through, what, like in Radishev's poem, for instance, we don't have this emphasis on physicality. We don't have any description of the pain that she was going through or his pain in seeing her pain, for instance, right? So there is this whole dimension that in a way is missing from that experience. Or if I think about the cycle by Državin, right? About we have Liebed's, Pamyatnik, and so on. There too, thinking about his own death becomes a chance to think about his legacy as a poet. So you see, there is still an amount of idealization, and we may even say kind of like a shift in a way, right? A thematic shift, right? And then thinking about poetry as immortalizing the author. We may see some hints at this in Bunina's poem, but again, she focuses so much on this present, right? And this awareness that she has that she will soon die, her time is really short, right? And so even if you can encounter these elements in Bunina's poem, again, the reflection is so strongly on her, on this unbelievable experience that she's going through. Whereas Državin instead focuses on his persona as a poet, his social role as a poet, what will remain of him after he dies. So he kind of sees still death as a bit like, he talks about it, but it's still a bit like far removed, we might say, or distanced. Whereas they are really bringing it very like close to their own experience. So this is the first thing that comes to my mind, but I also welcome any other, I don't know, reflections that you may have.
We have another question from Amanda in the chat section.
I feel like I'm asking too many questions. I was just wondering about if when women have this eye, this kind of documentary eye that is being framed, if I understand correctly, as kind of a movement forward or an innovation, is it actually in some ways conforming with this idea that women are incapable of creativity at a moment when that's kind of emerging, right, as what the poet is, that they don't imagine anything, right? They can sort of document what's happening to them as opposed to having some kind of, creative self that they're expressing, or imagination.
Where did
Maybe
you
that's
see
not clear. Well, sorry, the question, but I sort of got off track because there was a question earlier where you were talking about, if I understood you correctly, you were talking about the specificity of this deathbed experience and the sort of corporality of that as a new moment that these women poets were bringing into Russian poetry. And so I guess I was just wondering about the framing or thinking of, maybe even at the time in terms of reception, was that seen as, well, women, they're not actually like poets. They can just kind of write down what happens to them, but it's not actually genius or imagination or anything. So I was just wondering about the kind of framing of that at the time. It's been on my mind. I was going to ask you a related question. Well, if it's okay, I'll sort of add it on here. Thinking about the Bunyana poem and the Pragulka, I've been thinking about that idea of the walk, the wandering. And again, like wondering, what does it mean to be the woman doing that? If it's framed as like, oh, that's I think it's Hammerberg in her book talks about the idyll, talks about the wanderer as like it's solipsistic. And again, I'm wondering, okay, but so like when a woman does that, maybe I am gendering too much, but it makes me wonder about how that's received or understood, what might be seen as this important new moment for male poets, but maybe unseemly or uncreative or something when it's a woman doing it. So sorry, that was kind of long-winded.
Yeah, thank you. So you know, if we also look at other female we're writing 29 and so on, it seems to me, and there are also, you know, scholars like, you know, Roslin and so on, who kind of point out how there was this expectation, like there were very strong expectations as to what women could and should write about. And these expectations were mostly about the familiar sphere, friendly bonds and sentiments. And so they basically amounted to this very specific idea of what a woman is, who a woman is, right? Okay. So, and then if we look at the broader canon of 18th and 19th century women writers, poets, it seems to me that an ongoing trend when they are trying to introduce new themes is to kind of negotiate, right, between the expectation and the introduction of something new, right? And so in a way, I mean, in a way, the fact that the Moskvina are writing about this deathbed, it is really very much the expectation, in a way, we may say, right? Because what is more intimate, familial, and personal than a bedroom, basically, right? So in a way, and she is talking so much about her own feelings. So in a way, like from that standpoint, she is perfectly respecting the expectations of the time, also stylistically, right? She writes in a style that is, yes, solemn, but it's not an ode, a spiritual ode, right? It's very different. Also, the stanza structure is very free. The verse length is also very free, and so on. So, from this perspective, she does respect all, you know, we may say, the expectations of the time. But then, within this, sort of say, allowed space, she introduces something new, because she's not just in a bedroom, but she is on the deathbed. So, I mean, that's also a very different space. Try and think also for us, I think even today, reading a poem that takes place entirely in the deathbed. We have a woman who is ill, who is in the midst of this illness, is quite not sure what's going to happen afterwards, is trying to communicate with other people, but they can't. She's feeling all these things so strongly, but she kind of is unable to communicate them. There is that moment when she's like trying to look at her watch or clock, but she can't. So even actions that for us are so basic, I mean, how difficult is it? This not to us is like very easy, but for her is extremely difficult. It's almost impossible to do this, right? And so she even needs help, even to just look at the watch. So I mean, it is in a way painful experience to write, I think, such a poem, but also to read it. And if it is painful for us, I can only imagine for us, and I mean 21st century with like films and music and radio and all that, how strongly must it be perceived in the early 19th century, right? So it seems to me that they are, in this sense, negotiating what is allowed and trying to open up within that, I don't know, allow space, but I don't know, that seems to me, but also, yes. And as for the walking, I think, yes, it's very interesting, right? That, you know, a woman is walking alone in the streets. It's not really, I would say, the most common action to do, yes. So it's definitely a very strong claim for independence, I would say.
Thanks.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you, actually, I don't know if I can, but you previously mentioned this idea of this self-elegy, and I wanted to know, I don't know, what you meant by this. Or...
Oh, well, it was in that discussion about the funerary and bringing up the graveyard poetry, and I was thinking about other elegies. Even in my volume, some of the poems that I translated, one of them is, you know, mourning a sister and an elegy for sister and her death. Or there's Torchaninova, who has a poem that's actually called like, you know, Epitaph to Myself, where she's imagining her own gravestone. So I just kind of had those things in mind that I wondered if we were talking about genre or where this might fit in, if it was almost like an elegy that she was writing when she was going through her own death. And I don't know what that might bring up differently to, you know, just approach it from different sort of genre lenses, whether that might raise also some new questions or ways of thinking about it. That's all.
I think that what they are exploring in verses is not alien to territories that male writers were exploring at the same time. And you know, the focus on intimacy and home and even objects, like personal objects, made me think of a text that I worked on a few years ago, which is Дневник одной недели by Radishev, which is very reminiscent of all that. But I mean, the remaining question is why. Oops, I think that I've lost. No, I haven't. The question is why wouldn't they use verses to explore that? Why would male, you know, writers consider I mean, verses unfit? I'm just, you know, I'm flipping off the question. I'm just trying to look at it the other way around. Why would they consider it you know, unacceptable to write about that in verses? While they were using prose to write about that. And if you take, for instance, Radishev's private correspondence, you know, all his letters from Siberia, it's all about suffering and death and family relations and mourning, you know, people whom you're close to. So it's pretty much the same list of topics. And I'm pretty sure that he looked at his own letters as, you know, I mean, works of literature, but not in verse. So verse were appropriate for women to talk about the things that men were also discussing, but in prose. That's, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you know.
It is interesting. That's also why when there was a question about suicide, I was like specifying that I was talking about poetry, because then, yes, you go to prose and you do have instances. And they are about, you know, in a way, 10 or 20 years prior, right? If you think about, again, Radishev and Karamzin, but they are, again, prose. And so exactly what I find interesting is that this is going on in poetry and they are doing this in poetry instead. And so a possibility is that, again, given the expectations that they were about women, it was maybe more, I don't know, acceptable or for them to maybe bring this more intimate experience, right, of your own death, but also, you know, it could also be argued in a way against. And so it's also interesting, again, to see what you're saying. Like, I totally agree. And that's also something I find very, very interesting as a phenomenon.
Maybe verses are a way to mediate the representation of intimacy that makes it, when it comes to, you know, female intimacy, less disturbing for men to read. That would be the first that comes to my mind, but I don't know.
Yeah, and there is also this, I mean, very strong tradition throughout the 18th century of, you know, the big form of poetry, poetry from spiritual odes, panegyric, that are at least mostly, if not only, like male, right? So
I agree with that, but you also have, I mean, like lots of minor genres in poetry practiced by men in
yes.
the late 18th and early 19th century. And you have lots of male writers, you know, in the early 1800s, which is the period you're focusing on, who are not writing solemn odes anymore and who are writing only trifle poetry, you know, I mean, in France with people like Vigée, for instance, in Russia with, you know, my Безделицы, I mean, my trifles by Karamzin. So I mean, I think that it's probably something to explore, you know, the way that the verses make that less realistic, maybe, and then more acceptable in terms of social norms than prose, which is like too real and would make the representation of the intimate world of women too brutal to read about.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't know. Laura, you have a question?
Well, not a question, just a little remark. From Sappho on, so the representation of physical or love through physical sensations come from Sappho, and it was translated by Boileau, I think. So it was known and as accepted even in the 18th century. So 17th century. So, well, this is, I think, I was not thinking about it, but your words brought me to my mind. I think it's the answer to your question. So the model for this expression was female. This kind of expression was female and was back from Sappho.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I don't think not my answer, just a little a known fact.
Yes, yes, yes. No, thank you. Thank you for this. Yes, you're right.
It doesn't explain. I appreciated your paper very much, and of course, this is just a small remark. It's not the answer to anything, but I think it was worth saying it.
No, no, absolutely. It's worth including.
Supper, but that poem, he seems to me, well, it's very, very known, was very known, so I think they could have read or known about it. And so, thank you. I didn't know this poets, so it is very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Very interesting indeed. All right. I think we unfortunately have to wrap it up. Are there any more questions? We have a few minutes for a last question. You do have a question? No. No.
I have a little remark.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Erica. I just noticed that you employed a lot of time the word I. What did you mean by the word I? You representation? I noticed the number of occurrence of this word.
Yes, that's a very good question. By I to start by I mean basically the voice that says I in the poem, right? So, for instance, in Bunina's poem, the voice that is walking and questioning, observing nature, and so there are a lot of like first person utterances. So that I would say is the first way in which I mean this I, and then I mean it as, so going from this more like linguistic grammatical presence to a more the voice in the sense of like the perspective that is depicted and represented in the poem. So I would say probably these are the two main ways in which I mean the word I.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks again a lot, Erica. That was very enlightening indeed. And thanks for sharing with us these wonderful poems. I mean, you know, as Laura said, I didn't know them either, and I really enjoyed them very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks
a lot. Thanks a lot. Stay in touch. Thanks again. Great talk.
Have a great evening. Bye.
Now, good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Yeah.